If you want to be turning to Luke chapter 19, we're going to read there this morning in maybe a little bit different way than sometimes we do. But Luke 19, there's a story that is probably so familiar to most people here. Most people, probably the song will come into your head as soon as you hear the name. And it's one of those that was sung for years and years. Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he, right? And, you know, you think about that, and if Zacchaeus was here, he probably wouldn't be very happy about that song. Let's read this, and we'll talk about Zacchaeus just a little bit. Starting in chapter 19 of verse 1, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but being a short man, he could not because of the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He is gone to be a guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save what was lost." Zacchaeus, and as always comes to our mind first, he was short in stature. And really, I mean, you think about the song. It's entertaining for kids. Maybe it's entertaining because maybe they're wee little people, you know. But you think about that. It's really kind of cruel, and we laugh and we kind of make jokes about it. But you know, if somebody is short, maybe sometimes they laugh at the short jokes, or maybe they might even tell a short joke themselves because it's funny, and maybe it covers up the hurt. You ever been teased for anything? I mean, how does it feel to be teased about something that you can't do anything about? And it doesn't feel very good, does it? Not really. And you think about Zacchaeus. The Israelites aren't known for being tall people anyway. I mean, just in their genealogy, and you know, you had a few. Saul was described as being a head taller than everybody else. I mean, he had head and shoulders. Saul was this great big guy. He was great for a first king because that's exactly the kind of thing that they wanted. And so Saul was anointed by God to be king, and he was a tall man. And so you had some tall people, but in general, so when you think that Zacchaeus was shorter than everybody else in Jericho, he really was short. He wasn't a tall man, and probably growing up, he heard all the jokes. Probably growing up, he heard all the things that people would say that would make fun of somebody that was short. And you know, I can't help think of the song. I don't know, was it in the 70s? Short People. You guys remember that? You know, I mean, that's an extremely Sharon singing it over there. So yeah, it's an extremely cruel song when sing, but it was done tongue in cheek. But if you're short, you probably, you know, maybe you laugh at the song, and it depends on your personality. But you think about Zacchaeus and who he was. It says that he was a chief tax collector. He wasn't just a tax collector. He was a chief tax collector. He was over other tax collectors. I want to look just a little bit at tax collectors, but before we do, I mean, just thinking about the fact that here was this guy, he was probably made fun of, especially doing things like climbing in a tree to see over a crowd. But he was probably made fun of, but he emerged from this becoming a chief tax collector and becoming very wealthy. We don't know. He may have been wealthy to start with. He may have come from a wealthy family. We don't know that, but we do know that he was, as a chief tax collector, somebody that was very powerful. And it's not an unusual thing for somebody to do that, to compensate for how maybe they feel about themselves, to work hard at something to overcome. And think about the idea of tax collector. Let's look at this, because this kind of comes into play with this. There's some statements made through the Scriptures as far as tax collectors are concerned. And even Jesus recognizing, not saying he's condoning, but recognizing the way that people would treat tax collectors. When he's talking about somebody that is caught up in sin and not willing to make that right, I mean, they're just going to continue in that. In Matthew chapter 18, there's quite a discussion about that and approaching somebody with sin and that kind of thing. And that's not our topic this morning. Jesus makes a statement there that recognizes how the people treat tax collectors. He says, and I'm just going to take this up, and you'll just have to read the rest of it later if you would. Don't spend a lot of time on it right now, so we can continue on with the lesson. But in verse 17, if he refuses to listen to them, somebody who's sinning, if he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, treat him as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Now that puts the tax collector in a position of somebody that is shunned. And so Jesus just recognizing this is how the people treat these people. But in Luke chapter 3, if you want to just go back in Luke, we'll try to stay here for a little while. In chapter 3 of Luke, we see some statements made by Jesus that it doesn't mean that if you're a tax collector, that's the end of it and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. But if you're reading in Luke chapter 3, say, starting in verse 7, John said to the crowd coming out to be baptized by him, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the coming wrath? Produce fruit in keeping with repentance, and do not begin to say to yourselves, 'We have Abraham as our father.' For I tell you that out of these stones God can raise up children for Abraham. The axe is already at the root of the trees, and every tree that does not produce good fruit will be cut down and thrown into the fire." "What should we do then?" the crowd asked. Did I say Jesus earlier? I meant John. John answered, "The man with 2 tunics should share with him who has none, and the one who has food should do the same." Tax collectors also came to be baptized. "Teacher," they asked, "what should we do?" "Don't collect any more than you're required to," he told them. Then some soldiers asked him, "And what should we do?" He replied, "Don't extort money and don't accuse people falsely. Be content with your pay." And this goes on with this idea of these people asking John, trying to learn from John, how do we need to act? And even tax collectors were coming and being baptized, and they were asking, what can we do? And he's saying, don't collect any more than what you're required to. And it's because that's what they had the reputation of doing, was collecting more. See, within the Roman government, I know we've covered this before, but within the Roman government, they would go in, conquer land, and then they would use people within that ethnic group of people or race of people, or those that were nationals of wherever it was that they had conquered. They would use them for various positions in government authority. And so tax collectors were appointed out of the Jewish people that would collect the taxes. Of course, they would be sent to Rome, but they would make their living off of this, and they were renowned for taking more for themselves than what needed to be taken when Rome was already, just taxing people to death. And so you had this situation. They were considered traitors of the people. If you want to look at Matthew chapter 9, it's kind of an interesting passage there, because sometimes we forget that even those that Jesus chose were in occupations that had this kind of reputation. So Matthew 9, verses 9 through 13. It says, as Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. Yours may say Levi there. Just in translation, you'll see sometimes that's what comes across. But he says, follow me. He was sitting at the tax collector's booth, and Jesus says, follow me. He told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? On hearing this, Jesus said, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. So even Matthew himself, known as Levi before that, was a tax collector, and he was doing that when Jesus called him. And he followed Jesus. There were others. I mean, even because he would have that's probably most of the people that he would have had association with was other tax collectors. So when Jesus went to eat at his house, there were other tax collectors there. So it's very possible over here, as we're reading in Luke, that the same was true. I mean, we know that Jesus went to Zacchaeus' house. But you think about Zacchaeus becoming a chief tax collector, one that would have been over other tax collectors. It really kind of comes across that if somebody was going to do that, they would already know that people were not going to like them. If somebody was going to do that, they would already recognize. You know, it's not like being an IRS agent here. I mean, they're probably, you know, I mean, when you think of it in a general sense, you know, you don't think, well, I want to become a friend of somebody that works for the IRS. I mean, you know, we don't feel good if we find out we're being audited. It's not, you know, it doesn't give us the warm fuzzies. Oh yes, you know, I mean, just the idea of it, it doesn't set well with us. But it was even worse in this situation because you had somebody who was considered a traitor of the people. Somebody that was probably, I mean, very likely, because all of them were seen that way. That's even Jesus addressed that. John addresses that. You know, well, don't take more than what's yours. So that must have been going. The people didn't like it. And so he must have known if he was going to go into this occupation, if he was going to be a tax collector, that people wouldn't like it. Well, if you already have the feeling that people don't like you and people make fun of you and you're not accepted anyway because you're the short guy, what does it matter, right? And so go for it. And it's okay if people don't like me. I'm going to get rich. And Zacchaeus was a wealthy man. He was a tax collector. And it may say a whole lot about where he was feeling about himself. Because just success financially or powerfully doesn't necessarily mean that he was a happy man. Doesn't mean that he was content, because there was something that was really drawing him to see who Jesus was. Jesus was passing through Jericho. Did you catch that? He was passing through Jericho. There's no indication that he was planning on staying there. And there may be a lot, and maybe we can read things into that Jesus changed his plans just a little bit when he came across Zacchaeus. But there's no reason why Jesus wouldn't have already known who Zacchaeus was, that Jesus wasn't already expecting to see Zacchaeus. But when we see him, Jesus, it says, is passing through Jericho. And in verse 2, a man was there by the name Zacchaeus and starts talking about him. Well, he wanted to see Jesus, and so he ran ahead and he climbed up a sycamore tree. I mean, there is a sycamore tree in Jericho today that they called Zacchaeus' sycamore tree. And dating-wise, it's well over 2,000 years old. I mean, those trees lived very old, and they think that was a particular one. How they know that, or whether people talked about it from this day on and it got handed down, possibly. Can't say. I mean, we weren't there. We can't say whether it was or not. But there is one there. And it's interesting, when you look at these sycamore trees, they don't look anything like our sycamore trees. They were a type of fig tree. And they were used abundantly. But you could see how somebody, and a grown man climbing up in one. You know, kids climb trees all the time. Who climbed trees when you was a kid? All right. Almost, I mean, just hands go up everywhere. When was you climbed a tree in the last year? Raise your hand. Okay. A few of you have climbed a tree in the last year. But, you know, we don't make a habit anymore once you get a little bit older of climbing trees all the time. Tim does. Tim Horton, that's what he's doing for a living now, is cutting trees. But when we see this tax collector who is a wealthy man. He probably had nice clothes on, running ahead of the crowd and climbing up a tree. But they split off and many times kind of come out, where you've got a place to sit, and more like we might see a catalpa tree grow here as far as how the growth is of them. It's kind of interesting. He probably had a good place to sit. He probably wasn't just hanging on for dear life. He probably had a very good place to sit up in the tree watching for Jesus to come by. Never expecting that Jesus is going to say something to him. But Jesus does. Now you have to wonder, was everybody else looking at Zacchaeus? Here's Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector, and he's up in a tree. Were people snickering because they didn't like Zacchaeus and here he had to climb a tree? I mean, we don't know what was happening with everybody else at this point, or maybe disgusted, because they wanted to see Jesus. They wanted to experience Jesus like everybody else. So there was a crowd, because we know that because he couldn't see over the crowd. And so they wanted to experience Jesus. And here's Zacchaeus climbing up in a tree, distracting everybody. Or maybe even distracting Jesus. It could have been all of these things going through these people's minds. We can't read their minds. We don't know. But Jesus knew exactly what needed to happen, because there was a lesson that was going to come out of this, not just for Zacchaeus, but there was a lesson that was going to come out of this for the rest of these people, because they had an attitude. And if they had an attitude, Zacchaeus was feeling that attitude. So hopefully we can at least kind of place ourselves in Zacchaeus' shoes. Let's read it again with all that in our minds. Verse 1, chapter 19. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but being a short man, he could not because of the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. I must stay at your house today. It's not a request. It's not, "Hey, Zacchaeus, would you come down? Could I go to your house?" And Jesus says, "Come down from there immediately." I mean, sounds like a parent, doesn't it? Get down from that tree. Come down from there right now, because I've got to go to your house. Zacchaeus, he was excited. I mean, he was very glad, and so he came down from the tree. He came down and it says welcomed him gladly. All people saw this and began to mutter, "He's gone to be the guest of a sinner." Well, who were they? But we do that. We see somebody else in some other circumstance, and maybe the way that they're living, or the way that we perceive that they're living. It's kind of interesting what comes of this and the statement that Zacchaeus makes, because if he was extorting that much from the people, he wasn't going to be able to afford what he promised Jesus. We're going to look at that. But they had this attitude, they had this disdain. He's gone to eat with a sinner. But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor." So there's half of everything he has gone. Half is gone. And then he says, "And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." And he's going to have to get a loan if he's cheated a lot of people. So maybe it wasn't what he was doing. We can assume that he was doing that because tax collectors had that reputation, right? But we would have to assume that. And if we assume that he was cheating everybody, he wasn't going to be able to pay back 4 times, because he just gave his fortune away, half of it. So maybe we assume when we read some of these things the same way that these people would have assumed that he was taking more than what was his. But he says, if I have cheated anybody out of anything, and it doesn't seem like Zacchaeus is trying to get around anything here. It doesn't seem like Zacchaeus is saying, I don't know of anybody but he says, if I have. Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save what was lost. Hopefully, in some way, we can put ourselves in a position to say, okay, I know how Zacchaeus felt. And if we can do that, then we can look outside of ourselves and say, do I need to stop coming to conclusions about somebody else and whether or not they're going to receive salvation from Jesus Christ? Because maybe that person that we think is a traitor, maybe that person that we think is our enemy, maybe that person that we think is totally against us, maybe that person that we think there is no way they can change, might even be a Saul of Tarsus who is going to become a Paul. Because Zacchaeus, there was a lesson, and Jesus says, I must go to your house. That was probably for Zacchaeus because he had salvation now. But what about for everybody else? They needed to hear the same thing. They needed to see the same thing. And that's how Jesus works. Maybe it's about you sometimes, but maybe it's not fully about you and your salvation. Maybe it's about because you were saved, other people need to hear that. Maybe you were that person that everybody else was saying, not them. You won't find them inside church doors. You won't find them following Jesus. They're never going to repent. And maybe people need to hear about it. Because Jesus had to come to your house. If you guys want to come up, you can. Jesus didn't place stipulations on Zacchaeus. Actually, he placed more on himself than Jesus did. We don't know everything that Jesus said while he was there at the house. We don't know all the discussion that was taking place. But he didn't say, Zacchaeus, if you'll repent, I'll come to your house. He didn't say, Jesus, if you'll be baptized, I'll come to your house. That's not what was starting things. Jesus wanted to approach him. Jesus wanted to spend the time with him. It's interesting. When we read in Revelation chapter 3, and if you want to understand Revelation, read the first 3 chapters. You're definitely going to get those because he is very, very, very plain. When he's talking to the church at Laodicea, he ends this section by saying this in verse 20 of chapter 3. Here I am. I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with him and he with me. Come down from that tree. If you're here, you're looking. So come down from the tree. Jesus wants to come and eat with you. Whatever your response needs to be to this, whether it's personal, whether it's public, respond today to God. He wants to be at your house. If you need to respond as we stand and sing.